Welcome to Crazy About Creepy. Let's dive into our story today. And remember to like and subscribe for more creepy stories every week.
The other chair. I want to start by saying that I almost didn't post this. I sat on it for 3 weeks, opened the document, stared at it, closed my laptop, went for a walk, came back, made tea, let it go cold, stared at it again. My husband kept asking me what was wrong, and I kept telling him nothing. Just work stress. The usual. He's good at knowing when to push and when to leave things alone, and he left this one alone, which I'm grateful for, because how do you explain something like this to someone who wasn't there? How do you say it out loud over dinner, or in bed in the dark, or anywhere without sounding like you have completely lost your grip on reality? You don't. You just write it down and let it exist somewhere outside of you. And you hope that putting it into the world makes it feel less like it's eating you alive. My name is Dr. Claire Maddox. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I've been in private practice for 11 years, working with mostly adults, mostly anxiety, trauma, and dissociative disorders. I've worked with people who've experienced things most people can't imagine. I've sat across from people who are genuinely dangerous, people who are genuinely broken, people who are both at the same time. I've maintained composure in sessions that would have sent most people running for the door. I'm telling you all of this not because I think my credentials make me special, but because I need you to understand who I was walking into this. I need you to understand that I am a person trained to see clearly, trained to notice the things that get missed, trained to recognize when a mind is constructing a false narrative and why. I know exactly what delusion looks like, which is the only reason I can tell you how profoundly unsettling it is that I still don't know, even now, how much of what happened was something I caused, and how much was something done to me on purpose. The blog started 3 years ago, and it started the way a lot of things start, as something small for myself that got out of hand. I've kept session notes my whole career, detailed ones because I'm thorough, and because good notes protect everyone. But somewhere around year 8, I started writing differently, more narratively. I'd finish a session, sit at my desk, coffee going cold beside me, and I'd write not a clinical summary, but something closer to a story. The arc of a session, the way a particular patient's logic moved, the metaphors they used without knowing they were metaphors. I told myself it was processing, a way to decompress after carrying other people's weight for 8 hours. My own therapist, yes, therapists have therapists, please normalize this, we need it more than anyone, said it sounded like I was managing vicarious trauma through narrative externalization. She was probably right. She usually is. The writing helped. And then a colleague read one of the pieces over my shoulder at a conference, uninvited, which should have annoyed me more than it did. And she said, "Claire, this needs to be shared." I'm sure they meant publishing in a more conventional and respectable way, but I wanted something more anonymous, something that would not be so serious. So I started the blog. I called it The Other Chair, a reference to the seat across from mine, the one my patients sit in, the empty chair that means someone is about to walk in and trust me with something they haven't told anyone else. I was meticulous about anonymity from day one. Every name changed, every identifying detail altered, omitted, or deliberately obscured. Composite details where needed. I'd spent years thinking about patient confidentiality before I ever wrote a public word. The blog was not something I took lightly. It was small at first. Mental health professionals, grad students, people who'd been in therapy and found it validating to read about it from the inside. Normal stuff. I was writing about generalized anxiety, relationship patterns, avoidant attachment. Nothing groundbreaking. I liked that it was small. It felt manageable. Then I wrote about Patient M, and things became very different very quickly. I want to be careful here, even now, about what I share. Old habits from 11 years of keeping secrets that aren't mine. Even after everything, I feel the pull to protect him, which I've spent some time thinking about, and which probably tells me something unflattering about myself. What I can tell you is that Patient M came to me about 2 years ago. He was referred by a colleague who described him, in her brief and usually reliable way, as high functioning with dissociative features. He was in his mid-30s, professionally employed, data analysis, he said, though he was vague in ways I attributed to privacy rather than evasion. He was soft-spoken in the particular way of people who've learned that being quiet makes others underestimate them. Extremely intelligent. Precise about language in a way that I noticed in the first 10 minutes. The kind of person who will gently correct a word choice mid-sentence and somehow do it without the correction feeling rude, so that you end up feeling grateful for the clarification rather than irritated at the interruption. That's a skill. It takes practice. Our first session was unremarkable. He talked about sleep difficulties, mild depersonalization, trouble feeling present in his own life. The sensation, he said, of watching himself from slightly outside himself. Classic dissociative presentation. I took notes, established rapport, reflected back what I was hearing, scheduled a follow-up. Completely standard. Session 2 and 3 were more of the same. He was opening up slowly, which is normal, especially for people who've spent their lives controlling their own disclosure. I noted that he was thoughtful before answering questions, as if testing each word before he let it out. I noted that he never said more than he needed to. I noted that he watched me, not in a way that felt threatening exactly, but in a way that felt attentive in a direction I wasn't used to. Patients look at me, obviously, but they usually look at me the way you look at someone you're hoping will hand you something. He looked at me the way you look at something you're trying to figure out. It was around session 4 that things started to shift. He told me he'd been keeping a journal. Not unusual. I often encourage journaling, especially for patients with dissociative symptoms, because externalizing thoughts can help reestablish the boundary between self and experience. I said something supportive about that, but the way he described it made me stop writing for just a moment. He said he'd been documenting observations about a woman he encountered regularly. He described a methodical process, tracking behavioral patterns, noting inconsistencies between stated values and actual behavior, cataloging the gaps between what she presented and what he suspected she felt. He spoke about it with such detached, clinical precision that for a strange half second, it almost sounded like something I might have written in my own notes. I asked him, as carefully as I could, who this woman was. He paused for longer than felt comfortable. Someone who believes she understands people, he said, but doesn't understand herself at all. I moved the conversation elsewhere. I documented it. I told myself it was a transference issue, that he was projecting something about his mother or an old relationship or some internalized authority figure onto a real woman in his life. I told myself I'd return to it gently when the rapport was stronger. I started paying closer attention. The blog post I wrote about him, the first one titled The Observer, went up on a Tuesday night, and by Thursday, it had been shared more times than everything else I'd written combined. I don't entirely know how to explain what people responded to. Something about the way he existed on the page, even filtered through my writing, even stripped of everything identifying, something about his particular texture got under people's skin. Readers started calling him the analyst in the comments within hours. Some people found him chilling. Some found him deeply sympathetic, a lonely person trying to decode a world he'd never been taught to understand. A smaller but vocal group found him fascinating in a way that I was a little cautious about. The kind of fascinated that edges up against admiring. I kept writing. Every few weeks, a new post. The sessions were so rich with material that I barely had to embellish, and I was careful not to. I wrote about his childhood in fragments. A father who was exacting and largely absent, a mother he described as functionally invisible, present enough to be there, but not enough to be felt. He talked about spending most of his adolescence on the outside of social groups, not because he'd been excluded exactly, but because he'd found the inside confusing and decided to understand it rather than join it. He said he'd spent years watching people the way you watch a system, looking for the rules, the inputs and outputs, the underlying logic. And did you find them? I asked him. The rules? Most of them, he said. Enough. He said he'd gotten so fluent in the language of normal that by the time he was in his 20s, most people couldn't tell he'd learned it. Rather than grown up speaking it, only very careful observers would notice. What would they notice? I asked. He smiled. Not warmly, exactly, but not coldly either. More like someone acknowledging a reasonable question. That I'm always working, he said. I wrote that line almost verbatim in the next post. The comments section was unmanageable for 3 days. By post 5, I had a real readership. By post 7, there were Reddit threads. By post 8, someone had made a TikTok video analyzing his psychology that got 400,000 views, which meant people were watching a video about my writing about a patient's words, and the whole thing had taken on a kind of echo chamber quality that I was vaguely uncomfortable with, but not uncomfortable enough to stop. I should have been uncomfortable enough to stop. It was a comment that first planted the seed, though I pulled it up almost immediately. I got thousands of comments across the series, and I read far more of them than was healthy. But this one arrived sometime around post 7, from a username I didn't recognize. Just a string of letters and numbers, clearly not irregular. And it said, "Has it occurred to you that he might know about the blog?" I closed it. Moved on. Patient M had no way of knowing. I'd been meticulous. More meticulous than I'd ever been. And besides, he didn't strike me as the type to read mental health content online. He barely spoke about pop psychology, even dismissively, which I'd always read as intellectual snobbery, rather than unfamiliarity. But the comment stuck around in the back of my mind, the way things do when something in you knows something your conscious brain hasn't agreed to look at yet. Like a splinter you keep pressing with your tongue. The following session, I watched him differently. He was calm, as always, engaged. He talked about a recurring dream, a house full of rooms he'd never opened, which is a kind of imagery that writes itself. And I relaxed into the familiar rhythm of the work and told myself I was projecting. Then, at the very end of the session, with 2 minutes left, completely unprompted, he said, "I've been thinking about performance lately. the way we construct a self for an audience, how we craft a narrative we're presenting outward, and over time convince ourselves that the narrative is the truth rather than a version of it. I asked him to say more about that. People who study others for a living, he said, slowly, with that characteristic precision, have a particular vulnerability. They can mistake the act of observation for understanding, and they often don't notice that observation is never one-directional. My pen had stopped moving at some point in the middle of that. I don't remember when. He looked at me with the same expression he always wore. Patient, attentive, almost gentle. And something passed through me that I can only describe as the feeling you get when you realize you've been standing on something that isn't solid. Not a fall. Just the moment before. I finished the session, said the normal things, scheduled the next appointment. I drove home on autopilot. That night, I did something I am not proud of. I searched him, his name, every combination of it, plus professional directories, social media platforms, public records. I told myself I was looking for red flags I might have missed, that it was due diligence. It wasn't really. I was scared of something I couldn't name, and I was doing the thing anxious people do, which is try to control information. I didn't find anything alarming on its own. Clean public presence, professional seeming. Unremarkable. Then I tried something different, a phrase he'd used in sessions several weeks earlier. A specific and slightly unusual way he described the experience of emotional numbness, something I'd found so precise that I'd actually quoted it in one of the posts, in quotation marks, because paraphrasing would have lost something. I searched the phrase. One result. My blog. I stared at that for a long time, long enough that my husband came into the room to ask if I was coming to bed, saw my face, and quietly left again. I built the case for coincidence. Language converges, phrases that resonate do so because they're apt. And something apt enough to stick with me was apt enough to have originated somewhere in my own reading and been unconsciously attributed to him. Memory is reconstructive. I know this better than almost anyone. The phrase could have been mine all along. I believed maybe 60% of that. The 40% I didn't believe kept me up until 3 a.m. I need to tell you about Post 9, because Post 9 is where I think, looking back, the story actually is. Not in the twist at the end of it all, but in the moment where I should have seen what was coming and chose, somehow, not to. By this point, the readership had developed a particular quality. The people following this series weren't just interested anymore. They were invested in the way you get invested in a serialized story, which is a feeling that's harder to step back from than interest. They had theories. They had favorite moments. They had opinions about him that felt personal. There were people in my comments who wrote about Patient M like they knew him, like they'd sat across from him themselves. Post 9 was about what he'd started calling the project. He described it in session over 2 or 3 weeks, gradually, like he was revealing something he decided to share in controlled doses. The project was a long-term study he'd undertaken, his word study, of a specific individual. Not romantic. He was emphatic about that, in a way I found itself interesting. More like a research interest, he said. He had selected someone who presented a puzzle he found genuinely difficult, someone whose public self and private self were significantly misaligned, someone who believed with a confidence that he found both impressive and somewhat sad, that she was the one doing the observing. I wrote that up and posted it. and then sat back and read what I'd written and felt something cold move through me. But I told myself I was too close to it. Countertransference, the phenomenon where a therapist's own feelings start to color their perception of a patient, is real, and I was clearly experiencing it. The obvious explanation was that I was mapping myself onto the woman he was describing, because his description used language that could apply broadly, and my brain was doing the very human thing of pattern matching toward the self. I took a note to bring it to my own therapist. The comments on post 9 were different from the others. Less theorizing, more quiet. Someone wrote, "I don't think he's the patient in this story." Within an hour, someone had replied, "I've been thinking that since post 4. I closed my laptop. He terminated our work together 2 weeks after that session. A brief email. Professional. He said he felt he'd reached a natural stopping point, that he was grateful for the work we'd done, and that he wished me well. In the field, this happens often enough. Patients leave for all kinds of reasons, and closure isn't always a mutual process." I replied with equal professionalism. I said I was glad the work had been useful and that the door was open if he ever wanted to return. I felt, if I'm honest, a relief so significant that I recognized it as meaningful. Not the ordinary relief of a difficult session ending. Something bigger than that. Like something I'd been bracing against had walked out of the room. I thought that was the end. I thought about him less. I stopped checking the comments on the patient M posts quite so obsessively. Life continued. A month after his final session, I got an email. No subject line. A sender address that was clearly a disposable account. Something like a random string at a free mail service. No greeting, no signature. 3 sentences and an attachment. "You should read this. I think you'll find it interesting." I've been working on it for about 2 years. The attachment was a document, 47 pages, single-spaced, standard margins. Like a case study or a long research paper, it was titled "The Other Chair." My blog's name. Not a similar name. Not a coincidence of phrasing name. My blog's exact name, in the same font I used in the header, as though it had been lifted directly. I want to tell you, I opened it calmly. I did not. My hands were shaking enough that I misclicked twice and had to take a breath before I got the file open. Within the first page, I understood what I was reading. It was a case study of me. I'm not going to share all of it. Some of it I have not fully processed even now, 3 weeks and 6 rereads later. Some of it I have shared only with my own therapist and my husband, and watching my husband read certain sections was one of the more quietly devastating experiences of my adult life. But I'll tell you what it contained. 2 years of observations, documented with the same quiet, methodical precision he demonstrated in every session. Organized chronologically, then thematically, then into something that read disturbingly like a clinical profile. He had cataloged things I had never told another person. Behavioral patterns I wasn't consciously aware of. The way I arrange objects on my desk when I'm anxious. The specific verbal construction I use when I want to redirect a conversation without appearing to. The fact, and this one made me actually put the document down and walk to the kitchen and stand over the sink for a while, that I reach behind me and straighten the picture frame on the wall whenever a session is going badly and I'm trying to reestablish a sense of control. I do not do this consciously. I did not know I did it. I still only half believe it because I can't watch myself. And he is the only person who's ever told me. He had identified the blog from the first post. The first. He'd read all of it. He'd documented in a separate section the places where my account of our sessions diverged from his. The divergences were not flattering to me. He was meticulous about this too, citing specific posts by their publication date, noting the precise distortions, places where I'd unconsciously shaped the material to present myself as more insightful than I'd actually been in the room, places where I'd smoothed over my own discomfort, places where I'd written about understanding him when his notes, cross-referencing the same moment, showed that I'd missed the point entirely. He'd written it in the same register I used on the blog, first person, conversational. Even the section breaks were similar to mine. I don't know if that was intentional, the mirroring, or whether it was just the natural result of someone who'd read my work closely enough that my voice had gotten into his. Both possibilities disturbed me. Near the end, in a section titled Assessment, he'd written, Dr. Maddox is a skilled clinician with a fundamental blind spot. She believes that seeing something clearly means she understands it. She is perceptive and genuinely empathetic, which makes her blind spot harder to detect, including by her. She built an audience around the project of studying me. She narrated the process in real time, publicly, and experienced the narration as a form of mastery. What she did not account for is that I was in the room too. I was always in the room. She looked at me and wrote about what she thought she saw. She never seriously considered what I might be seeing when I looked back. And then, after a section break, this. She will post about this. She won't be able to help it. The writing is how she processes, and this is the biggest thing she's had to process in years. When she does post about it, she will frame it as a cautionary tale, or an act of transparency, or both. She may genuinely believe that framing. What she will not be able to admit, possibly even to herself, is that she's posting it for the same reason she posts everything. Because she wants to be seen. Because the audience has become part of how she understands herself. In that sense, at least, she will finally be telling the truth. I've been sitting with this for 3 weeks. I've shown the document to my own therapist, who had a great deal to say and urged me, gently and then less gently, not to publish anything. I've talked to my husband, who had a different kind of reaction, less clinical, more personal, harder to sit with. He thinks I should take some time off. Regroup. It makes sense. It's the same advice I would give someone in my position. I've read the document 6 times, and I am no closer to a confident explanation of how he knew certain things. I have theories. None of them are comforting. Here is what I've decided I know. He was a patient. That part was real. The sessions happened. The blog existed, and he found it. And he recognized himself. And he made a decision, early, deliberate, about what to do with that information. And what he decided was not to confront me, not to report me, not to disappear. What he decided was to continue, to keep coming in, to keep talking, to let me keep writing, while he wrote something else. I don't know what to call what he did. I've thought about it from every angle I have available to me, and I keep arriving at the same place, which is that the categories don't quite fit. Was it manipulation? In some sense. Was it a violation? In some sense. Was it also, in a way I find uncomfortable to acknowledge, exactly what I was doing to him? Studying someone, documenting them, turning them into content, just pointed in the other direction? I've thought about that a lot. His last line keeps coming back to me. She will finally be telling the truth. Because here's the thing. He's right that I'm posting this. And he may be right about why. I've tried to interrogate my own motives with the same rigor I'd apply to a patient's, and what I find is messy and not entirely flattering. There's the genuine desire to be transparent. There's the processing, the writing to understand that I've always done. There's also, underneath it, something that wants to be witnessed. Something that believes a thing isn't fully real until someone else knows it happened. He saw that in me, apparently, before I fully saw it in myself, which is either a remarkable feat of human observation or something darker that I haven't finished thinking about yet. I don't know which it is. I'm not sure I get to know. What I know is that he's out there somewhere, and he knew I'd write this, and he's probably reading it right now. And I'm aware that by posting this, I am doing the thing he predicted, which means in some sense he's still in the room, still working. And I'm still in the other chair. Comments are open. I thought about closing them. I left them open because I think I want to know. I need to know whether you saw what he saw, whether it was visible from the outside all along, whether I was the only one who didn't know. I think I already know the answer. Tell me anyway.
Thanks for watching. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And if you have a creepy story to share, send it to us. We would love to hear it.